A peaceful afternoon and a familiar road.
Kate Bushell, 14, only planned to walk her dog for 15 minutes. But somewhere out of sight, someone was waiting. 15 minutes, and she never returned. This is a case that has haunted Devon for nearly 30 years. Not because of a lack of clues, but because those clues lead to nothingness.
It was just a short walk, no more than 15 minutes from home. In that time, something happened so brutal, so inexplicable, that it would scar a quiet English community for decades. And yet, nearly 3 decades later, the case remains a riddle. Not because there are no clues, but because the clues seem to lead nowhere at all. On the late afternoon of November 15, 1997, 15-year-old Kate Bushell left her home in the Exwick area of Exeter, Devon, to take her dog Gemma for a walk along the familiar footpath that wound its way past the fields toward the open countryside. She was wearing blue jeans, a navy fleece jacket, and white training shoes. A perfectly ordinary outfit for an ordinary day. The weather was cool and still, the kind of early winter light that turns gold before sinking into gray. She told her parents she'd be back soon. She never returned alive. Kate's father was the first to sense something was wrong. Gemma, the family's border collie, was found wandering near the footpath alone, her lead dragging, eyes wide and agitated. Moments later, a passerby spotted something in the grass. A flash of pale skin, a still form. Kate lay there, her throat cut in a single, savage motion. The killing was both sudden and deliberate, suggesting the work of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The police descended on the scene quickly. The area was cordoned off, and within hours, officers in white forensic suits combed the footpath for evidence. According to the official police reports and contemporary newspaper articles, there were no signs of sexual assault, no robbery, and no clear motive. It was, in their words, an unprovoked, frenzied act of violence. But in the days and weeks that followed, locals began telling a slightly different story. Some said they'd seen a man, thin, in his late 30s or 40s, with a scruffy beard, lurking near the fields that week, as though watching the path. Others swore they'd noticed a small blue car parked in a lay-by nearby, engine running, as if someone was waiting. These details appear only sporadically in the press coverage, almost as if they were deliberately underplayed. The timeline reconstructed from the official investigation is tight. Kate left her house around 4:30 p.m. By 5 p.m., her body was discovered. That leaves a window of barely 30 minutes for the killer to act and escape unseen. Yet this was not an isolated lane. People used the path frequently. Witness statements gathered in the days after mentioned walkers, cyclists, even children heading home from nearby playing fields. And yet no one reported hearing a scream. No one claimed to see the fatal attack. The inquest records and archived articles suggest the wound was inflicted with a sharp blade, possibly a craft knife or small kitchen knife, something easily concealed. This fits with the theory that the attack was sudden, perhaps from behind, leaving Kate no time to react. But among the locals, an unsettling rumor began to circulate that Kate had been followed, not just that day, but in the weeks leading up to her death. One neighbor claimed to have seen her walking her dog alone several times with a man in a dark coat keeping his distance. Another recalled Kate mentioning she felt someone was watching her during her walks. These claims were never confirmed in official records. They exist in the gray space between fact and folklore, repeated in whispers but absent from the final police statements. In the aftermath, more than 100 officers were assigned to the investigation, and over 4,000 statements were taken. The case made national headlines for a brief, intense period before fading into the background noise of other crimes. Yet in Exeter, the murder became a shadow over the town. Parents warned their children never to walk alone. Joggers avoided the path at dusk, and still there were details that never quite lined up. The official timeline made sense on paper, but on the ground, it was harder to reconcile. How could someone commit such a violent act in daylight on a public path and vanish without a single reliable witness? The police sketches based on the fragmentary descriptions from locals seemed almost generic. A thin man, average height, dark hair. It could be anyone. It could be no one. Some journalists speculated the killer was a transient worker or drifter passing through. Others pointed out that the precision of the attack suggested a certain familiarity with the area, maybe even with Kate's routine. The combination was chilling, a crime that seemed both random and deliberate. And behind the neatly written police summaries and the carefully worded press conferences, there was the persistent, quiet murmur among those who lived in Exwick, that there was more to the story than anyone was officially saying. In the weeks after Kate's murder, Exeter was no longer the quiet cathedral city people thought it was. Uniformed officers patrolled footpaths at dusk, and a police incident room buzzed day and night. The official narrative, reported in clipped lines in the Western Morning News and BBC regional bulletins, spoke of extensive inquiries, vital leads, and public assistance needed. Yet behind those statements was a kind of tightening silence. For all the manpower, the case seemed to drift sideways rather than forward. Detectives appealed for sightings of a man in a red jacket walking near the Exwick playing fields. A possible sighting of Kate shortly before her death was reported by a school friend who thought she saw her near a kissing gate along the path. These facts appear in the police log, but there were also reports, unconfirmed, secondhand, that someone had been seen standing near the entrance to a nearby allotment that afternoon, not moving, just watching the path. That detail never made it into the televised appeals. By early December, the investigation had taken on two distinct shapes: the clean, orderly structure of official police work and the messy, shadowed version that lived in the minds of residents. The official side focused on canvassing homes, tracking down anyone who had been on the path that day, and analyzing fibers, hairs, and trace evidence from the scene. They announced that several items were sent to the Forensic Science Service, though no significant results were made public. The unofficial side and the whispered version spoke of a car seen leaving the area too fast minutes after the estimated time of death, and of a man who suddenly left a local lodging house the following day without collecting his belongings. In January 1998, police began door-to-door DNA collection in parts of Exeter, asking men to volunteer samples. It was one of the earliest uses of mass DNA screening in Devon. On paper, it looked thorough, even progressive, but it also sparked quiet distrust. Some locals wondered why, if the killer was truly a stranger passing through, the dragnet seemed to focus so tightly on a small radius around Exwick. Others felt it was an admission that the investigation had stalled. Newspaper archives from that period show a strange rhythm: bursts of police appeals followed by long gaps with no updates. It's during those gaps that rumors took root. A shopkeeper recalled seeing Kate in the weeks before her death with a man she didn't recognize, browsing in a stationery shop. A retired postman claimed that years earlier, there had been another attack on a teenage girl in the same general area, though less severe and never reported in the press. No official source confirmed these accounts, but they were repeated enough to take on their own life. When you read the coroner's inquest notes, the language is restrained, almost sterile. Death due to incised wound to the neck. No evidence of sexual interference. No signs of prolonged struggle. But when you speak to people who still remember that day, a different kind of detail emerges. They recall how Gemma the collie refused to walk that path again. How the autumn leaves around the spot where Kate was found seemed to be raked away within hours by men in unmarked clothing, not the usual scene of crime officers. How certain witnesses who spoke to the press early on later refused to say anything more. The police did release one particularly curious piece of evidence. The killer may have had orange or red animal hairs on their clothing, believed to come from a domestic cat. The theory was that the killer owned a cat or had recently been in contact with one. It's a tiny, almost trivial clue. And yet, according to former detectives interviewed years later, it was considered potentially vital. Still, no one with a matching description in a cat was ever brought to trial. By the turn of the millennium, the investigation had been scaled back. Leads were exhausted. The case slipped from national headlines. But in Exwick, the memory lingered, and so did the questions. Some locals grew convinced that the killer was known to someone in the community. Others argued the opposite, that it was a one-off, a stranger who had chosen his moment perfectly and disappeared. But there was one line of speculation more unsettling than either. It came from an elderly man who claimed that years before, he'd seen police cars in the same lane, responding to an incident that was never reported in the papers. He believed the authorities knew more about the path and who used it than they ever admitted. Reading through the official case summaries today, you find almost no mention of this earlier incident. It may have been nothing. It may not have happened at all. But in a case defined by its absences, absent witnesses, absent motive, absent suspect, even the shadows cast by unconfirmed stories seem to demand attention. And perhaps that's what has kept the murder of Kate Bushell alive in the public mind for so long. The persistent sense that between the clean lines of the official record and the tangled threads of local memory lies a gap. And in that gap, the truth may still be hiding. By the early 2000s, the Bushell case had entered that difficult territory known to detectives as the cold zone. The initial surge of manpower was long gone. Evidence bags sat in storage. The witness lists gathered dust. In theory, the case remained open. In practice, it had receded to the edges of active policing, revived only when anniversaries or media features brought it briefly into the light. Yet even in this quieter phase, fragments kept surfacing. In 2007, Devon and Cornwall police launched a public appeal saying advances in forensic technology might help. They spoke of re-examining items from the scene, of searching for microscopic traces overlooked a decade earlier. It sounded promising, but whatever those tests found, nothing was made public. Over the years, certain elements of the story have grown more pronounced, while others have faded entirely. The man in the red jacket, for example, still appears in police literature as a key figure, even though he has never been identified. The rumored blue car, once a staple of local conversation, now rarely comes up in official contexts. And the orange animal hairs, that strangely specific clue, remain unexplained. In some retellings, they are almost forgotten, as though the detail never mattered. But it did matter. It mattered enough for officers to spend weeks quietly checking households in the area with cats of a matching color. When you speak to people who lived in Exwick in the late 1990s, they often describe a sense that the investigation was running along two parallel tracks. The public-facing one was careful, methodical, and largely unrevealing. The other, hinted at in pub conversations and whispered over garden fences, was more chaotic, full of half-seen figures, odd behaviors, and people who left town suddenly. One man recalled how a neighbor, normally friendly, became tense and withdrawn after the murder, eventually moving away without a word. Another spoke of seeing two plainclothes officers watching a house several streets from the Bushells' home late at night, weeks after the murder. The official record does not confirm these accounts, nor does it deny them. And therein lies the tension. In the absence of definitive answers, the mind stitches together its own version from scraps. That's how a police sketch becomes a face in your memory, how a rumor about a man with a knife becomes something you swear you saw yourself. In 2017, on the 20th anniversary, the case briefly returned to national attention. A senior detective stood before the cameras, stating that someone out there knew the killer's identity and that loyalty, fear, or shame was keeping them silent. He repeated the appeals for information, described the original investigation as one of the most extensive in the force's history, and emphasized that the crime scene had yielded items of interest still under review. It was a professional, tightly controlled statement, but those who knew the case intimately noticed what wasn't said. There was no mention of certain witness statements, no reference to possible links with other incidents in the wider Devon area. Among the more persistent local theories is the idea that Kate may have been targeted not at random, but because of something she'd seen or overheard. Something seemingly small, but significant to the wrong person. It's impossible to prove, and the police have never endorsed the idea. Still, the theory fits a certain unease, that the killing was quick not just to silence her in that moment, but to prevent something from being spoken later. As you follow the case through old clippings and archive broadcasts, you notice how the language shifts over time. Senseless murder becomes unsolved murder, which eventually becomes cold case. Each phrase feels like a step further from the immediacy of that November evening. And yet, for those who passed the field where she died, the scene hasn't lost its presence. Some locals say they still feel a chill there, even on bright days. A few avoid it entirely, as if walking that path is a silent trespass into unfinished business. The truth about what happened to Kate Bushell on that late autumn afternoon may still be contained in a locked evidence drawer, or in the memory of someone who has never spoken. Or it may lie in the space between official statements and unrecorded stories, in the contradiction between what is known and what is told. Cases like this rarely end in revelation. More often, they dissolve into layers of certainty and doubt until the two are indistinguishable. On paper, it is a straightforward mystery. A young girl, a short walk, a violent death, and an unidentified killer. In life, it is messier, heavier, filled with silences that feel deliberate. And in those silences, the shadow of that November evening still lingers, waiting perhaps for someone to listen closely enough to hear what has been there all along.
Thank you so much for watching and supporting the channel. If you found this story informative, please consider liking the video, subscribing, and sharing it with others who enjoy true crime content. Your support helps us bring you more real stories that deserve to be told. Stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.